I'm Sara Guyer. I am Dean of the Division of Arts and Humanities here at UC Berkeley. And I want to welcome you all to Cults and Conspiracy Theories, featuring two of our stellar professors in the Arts and Humanities. This is our inaugural virtual event showcasing arts and humanities research. And we're focusing on a topic that has, as everyone here knows, grown much more timely and significant since we first hatched the idea of having this conversation. Today, for many, the first response to a significant event is to speculate that there is a conspiracy behind it. From the Epstein files to political violence to new and emerging technologies, we're here today to ask what is happening. How do ideas, good, bad, weak, fictional, travel? And how do communities that are built around them grow? Is this a novel phenomenon tied to our moment, or is it part of a recurring pattern across human time? These are some of the questions that our panelists are going to help us navigate this evening. They're also going to make clear why curiosity-driven research is so important. We often don't know in advance how our research will have an impact. It is when we foster an environment of open inquiry that we can meet our moment. If we're only looking to solve the problem in front of us, we won't be prepared for the challenges that we don't yet know. This is true in the sciences, where so much of our impact is the effect of research that was not designed to have impact, but merely to understand the world and its systems. But it's also true in the humanities. As we will hear today, research in very old social media, for example, can have an outsized effect on our understanding of communities and networks in our age of new and exploding technologies. Untimely research like this in fields like Scandinavian studies, driven by a desire to understand history or art or ideas, is a powerful resource that we need to preserve so that it is there when we most need it. And to be frank, in this moment, our 19 departments and 14 research units in the arts and humanities are starting to look like endangered species. But Berkeley is where they will continue to flourish, because at Berkeley, we will fight for their survival. I am committed as Dean of Arts and Humanities to ensuring that critical inquiry and research in the arts and humanities are supported and integral to our university. And most of you here tonight are alumni or supporters or even members or former members of our faculty. And you understand that this is our project today. I want to thank you for remaining connected and for spending part of your evening with us. You enable us to pursue our mission, even in challenging times, and to remain the #1 public university in the world. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker this evening is Tim Tangherlini, the Elizabeth H. and Eugene A. Shurtleff Chair in Undergraduate Education and a professor in the Department of Scandinavian Studies and the School of Information. Tim is a leader in the emerging field of computational folklore, and he uses data-driven methods to track everything from conspiracy theories like QAnon, and I'm sure there are more to come, to historic Nordic flavor profiles, to the dynamics of vaccine hesitancy. Following Tim, and we'll just go straight through, following Tim is Poulomi Saha, who's one of the nation's leading experts on cults and teaches one of UC Berkeley's most popular courses, Cults and Popular Culture. Poulomi is an associate professor of English and co-director of the program in critical theory here. And her work spans Asian American literature, post-colonial studies, and queer and feminist theory. Finally, before Tim gets started, a bit of housekeeping. We are keeping the audience muted so we don't experience the kind of ambient, unnecessary noise that sometimes happens in large Zooms. But we are recording this talk, so you can and we will share it with those who aren't able to join us this evening. Poulomi and Tim will both give about a 10-minute overview of their research as it relates to cults and conspiracies. And then we will invite you to submit questions in the chat for all of us, for them to discuss. One of our staff members in the room is going to compile the questions, and then I will read them. So make sure that you know, I want to make sure that you know that your questions will be received over the course of the evening. Please use the chat for that function. So thank you again for coming. And Tim, why don't you get started?
Thank you so much, Dean Guyer, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of my research with you and over the course of the next hour or so. Although I promise not to speak for an hour, I will go through my slides here. I'm a folklorist. I study aspects of popular culture, both historically and contemporaneously. And I've been asked to talk to you a little bit this evening about conspiracy theory and the need for what I call a computational folkloristics. So folklore, just as a review, is vernacular, informal, cultural expressive forms which circulate on and across social networks. It's marked by considerable variation, and it emerges from this dialectic between the individual and the group. One of the things that we find over this sort of informal storytelling, which we're all familiar with, it becomes incredibly efficient at encapsulating what I refer to as cultural ideology, norms, beliefs, values. And we use these stories as a way to negotiate our way through groups, belonging and exclusion, and everyday life. In the current age, we have access to millions of posts, texts, memes, images, videos that are going to reflect the negotiation of informal culture. But going back to what Dean Guyer had mentioned, there's a historical component to this as well. So one of the big collections I work with was collected in 19th century Denmark, a period of incredible change, upheaval, shifts in agricultural economy, shifts in social and political organization. And we find that people are telling stories that are trying to understand these changes around them and often ascribing threat or blame to other communities. So I'm very interested in these processes. Now, what's interesting is today, computational methods are perfectly situated to assist in our study of these phenomena on social media, in large part because those large language models that you're chatting with have been trained on this very material. And so that's why we combine folklore with computation. So let's talk about a particular form of folklore. This is stories. Stories, anecdotes, rumors, personal experience stories form an enormous part of our everyday life, but are also reflected in social media platforms. And what I think is interesting is that we've all grown up telling and listening to stories that are meaningful in the various groups in which we live our lives. So we've all become expert at telling stories. They're not innocuous. Stories are not innocuous. When I was first studying stories, my roommates were like, "Why are you studying stories? These are irrelevant." But they're not. They help us understand the world around us. They help us signal to others what we're going to do in a given situation, and they help inform us as to the decisions we should make. So we use storytelling to inform a lot of our decision making. And this is why I tell my students that Ghostbusters in some ways asks the most profound philosophical question of the 20th and 21st century. When ghosts appear in the neighborhood, who are you going to call? The answer to that question is ideological. You do not answer that question sort of off the cuff. Who you call in the context of threat is extremely important. Now, I refer to these using sort of scholarly convention. We call these legends and rumors. These are sources of information that thrive in low trust or low information environments, or a combination of both. So if I don't trust my sources of information, I turn to my friends, I turn to my community, turn to the people around me. And if I don't have access to information, I'm going to do the same thing. So we might be in a situation now, as my 19th century farmers were, in a combination of low trust, low access environments. And so that's where storytelling often thrives. Now, just to give you some sort of academic, what we call edict definition of what legend is, it's short, it's believable, one thing happens, it's told as true, often in informal settings, often conversationally. These are the stories that you swap over pizza and beer with your friends. Now, rumor is simply a hyperactive state of this legend, but it often doesn't include the retrospective aspect. It says, here's a threat. What are you going to do about it? Here's something that's confronting us. What should we do about it? Now, what's interesting is we find in our research is that conspiracy theories aggregate these stories and other beliefs into a totalizing whole. So if your strategy is to, when you're confronted with a witch in 19th century Denmark, is to call the minister, think again, the minister is married to a witch. If your strategy is to go to the manor lord who runs the farm, think again, the manor lord got all his wealth from Satan. The Satan is the one who controls witches. Everywhere you look, your ideas of who to call get cut off by this narrative framework that is bringing together different beliefs, different domains, and creating a totalizing whole. So who do we rely on to deal with threat? We often have to rely on ourselves. Now, a lot of stories rely on a reservoir of beliefs and earlier stories that are already in circulation. As we grow up in communities, right, we get enculturated communities, we hear the stories, we hear the beliefs, they get reinforced. When you're exposed to a belief, it's not as if you're inoculated against it, you're inoculated for it. And so probably they're physiological processes, they're certainly social processes that create a community of belief, and the stories that circulate are ones that resonate with those beliefs that we have. So virality and resonance may be based on the emergence of a new context for the reformulation of earlier narrative segments, new and old actors, and a series of threats and strategies that we're already familiar with. So one of our open questions right now is what makes something stick? What makes a story resonate across multiple domains? And that's open. We're working on that. But that I think will be a very interesting thing for us to understand how communities form and how they signal to others who belongs, who doesn't belong. Um, and this goes to something that we saw in the past election cycle was all of this discussion of they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, this sort of narrating of threat. What I found interesting about that was this was in a contemporaneous American situation, but 30 years earlier, I had written an article about immigrants eating dogs and cats of the people who live in Copenhagen, right? Going back to my Danish stuff. And in that article, I talked about how this was a common motif in stories that were circulating, guess what, amongst 19th century Danish farmers worried about what was going on in the social and political environment around them. So that's that reservoir of stories, that reservoir of beliefs that we can reactivate in new contexts. One of the things that we were concerned about and curious about was, is the real world perhaps messier than fiction? And so we thought maybe fiction's messier than the real world. We were looking at a conspiracy theory, narrative, stories that sort of aggregated into something that was referred to as Pizzagate. And if you've ever watched television and watched a detective show, you see the detective always has a wall of crazy, we call it. Or if you think about those representations of conspiracy theorists with their tinfoil hat, they always have what we call a wall of crazy. It's actants and the relationships between them. So we thought, can we extract a wall of crazy from all of the posts surrounding Pizzagate from Reddit? The answer, of course, is yes, and that's what it looks like. And you've got these different communities, and you can see who is in this power graph. So we said, oh, well, what about Bridgegate, which was an actual conspiracy? And it turns out the actual conspiracy is hidden in that hairball. We call this kind of network a hairball. So the real world is actually far messier than fiction. That confirms that conspiracy emerges in narrative. It's a storytelling process. And for me, that's very interesting. I'm interested in storytelling processes and how those get abstracted from the messiness of real life. So when we started looking at Pizzagate, we realized that there were a bunch of disconnected conversations going on. There was a conversation about democratic politics. There was a conversation maybe about the Podesta brothers. There was a conversation about casual dining. And weirdly, there was a conversation going on about Satanism. But these were disaggregated. They were disjoint conversations until people came in and started interpreting WikiLeaks data. And at that point, we see all of these things become connected. That's the mechanism for conspiracy theory. Low probability links create a narrative whole, which allow us to jump from democratic politics to underground tunnels where people are trafficking in children as part of a satanic cannibalistic cabal. We wanted to match that against something like Bridgegate, which we were able to do, but one of the things we discovered was the disparate discourse and domains of discourse were not actually present in an actual conspiracy. All of this was New York and New Jersey politics. And if we deleted the conspiracy from the network, this horribly complicated network, New Jersey and New York politics would continue along without a blip. It was almost as if the conspiracy was hiding in this thicket of edges, whereas conspiracy theory, because it only emerges in narrative, is much more sparse. Uh, of course, we were fortunate that the global pandemic hit at this point, and we were already monitoring lots of social media and discovered all of these narrative nucleations. And as QAnon came on the scene, it started drawing these different narrative domains together, again, through this process of low probability links. Separated communities were connected by these unverifiable edges from QAnon, and this created an overarching element of QAnon where COVID was subsumed under that broader QAnon umbrella. We, of course, then turned our attention to Parler, and we were applying the same methods, and we were trying to discover the actants and their roles, and we were trying to model the edges between them. As we did this, it was very clear that there was a consistent, persistent narrative driving all the conversations on Parler in a truly folkloric process. We learned that conversations on Parler were ideologically consistent throughout. There was very little room for dissent. It was what we call an echo platform. New events were fit into this existing belief framework, and the existing belief framework drove real world actions. So again, storytelling is not innocuous. And when we see this, we see the power of storytelling, and we see the totalizing worldview that comes from conspiracy theory, whether it's in 19th century Danish farmers or whether it's in contemporary social media. What was interesting there was the end result was that the strategy that was decided upon was one that was violent and one that was seen as necessary. And that's alarming, but also in some ways predictable. So one of the questions I have, because we can show that we can use this approach really for bad, right? We take these graphs that we've created, we sample over them and add them to a chat agent, and then we throw in some robots, and one could uh, 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 fundamentally uh, have an effect on a social media platform. But I'm much more interested in social good. How do we use storytelling for social good? So a great deal of attention has been focused on attacking improbable connections, what I would be calling misinformation or disinformation. But could we focus on other parts of the narrative? I was interested in what the people of Springfield did narratively. They shifted away from an exclusionary perspective in their retelling of the story to an inclusionary perspective. And that's something that we get from the humanities, this idea of how do I broaden community? And to understand how we broaden community, we have to understand how these exclusive narrative practices have functioned historically and over time. Maybe we could look at different results and outcomes. What would this look like? That's open. And so I actually pose that to you. What would that look like if we could use narrative in this way in positive and for positive social gain? So thank you so much. This is our current work. We're trying to understand narrative, belief, and resonance. And that's actually a very hard. Every one of those words, narrative, belief, and resonance, is really hard. But with my group, we make use of our humanistic background, our understanding of languages, and we try to do this both historically and contemporaneously. So thanks. And I'm going to give the baton. I'm going to pass the baton, the virtual baton, right over to Poulomi.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm afraid that I'm going to show you that I'm not a computational person by showing how difficult it is for me to share my screen. So apologies while I try to do that. I am really delighted to be here to join a group of, I'm going to call us a collection of humanists, and especially to get to be in conversation with my friend and colleague, Tim, who has teed up my comments so beautifully, partly because our work resonates in exciting and sometimes uncomfortable ways with each other. So as you've heard, I am a professor of English and I co-direct the program in critical theory. I was trained in fairly standard and well-respected fields. And so you may be wondering how I ended up in the seedy world of cults. I'm happy to talk more about the long journey that got me here. But I will say that for me, cults fall fully within the realm of literary studies and humanist critique for exactly the reason we're here tonight. They're about storytelling. Cults, as I show in my work and teaching, are not so much a thing as a fully contained narrative. The word cult supplies in and of itself a vocabulary, a catalog of feeling for groups whose practices and beliefs produce in us a sense of disavowal, but also gripping curiosity. It provides in one word an entire narrative arc that unfolds almost in an unthinking way. When you say, is that a cult? You actually narrativize what you already think you know about the object in front of you. The cast of characters, the charismatic leader, the wide-eyed followers, the tragedy that has to be at the end, the great rise, the inevitable fall, the secret inside. When we say the word, we think we know what we're talking about. But are we always talking about the same thing? And if we are, what does that mean that cults have made us? And that's what I want to talk about today. But before I fully jump in, I'm going to apologize for my hyperbolic title. Fascinated how a global obsession with cults is changing everything. This is exactly the kind of title that I have spent 2 decades training my students not to write, because we always teach as humanists nuance and historicism. We want to talk about how things are complicated, and it's true that cults are complicated. But hyperbole is sometimes really useful because hyperbole is a way of exaggerating something to make a point incredibly clear. The hyperbolic statement that a global obsession with cults has changed everything may not be strictly true. Everything may not have been changed by a moment that we've been in for about 10 years now, one that I study and I call a cult culture boom, where if you tune in on any major streaming platform at any given time, at least a dozen cult documentaries are available for you to watch. There are hundreds of cult podcasts. If you travel down Reddit rabbit holes, you'll find at least one subreddit for anything you might want to call a cult. And indeed, for the last 7 years, every semester that I've taught this class on cults, between 200 and 600 students pack in because they think cults are essential to their life. These aren't some abstract object out there. They're in our homes, in our ears, at our dining table, in our minds. And we have been fundamentally changed by their intimacy in our lives. So, sure, our obsession hasn't changed everything, but I do think this global cult obsession, which appears especially in media, has changed us. And so that's what we're going to talk about. How did we get here? How did we get to a point where cults, which were once the matter of fringe and often embarrassing or even taboo belief, became the object of popular culture, where we invite them into the most intimate parts of our life, where my students often confess to me that first date questions involve whether someone is a cult leader or a cult follower. The question of how cults became such the bread and butter of our life begins, to me, with my friend Sigmund Freud. Freud, who I hope most of you know, was a psychoanalyst, but took up the question of what it's possible for us to want as individuals in the world. And what he writes about a phenomenon called repression in the interpretation of dreams is this, that repression is not actually the eradication of what we want. It is actually, he says, censorship, but censorship of a desire that can't exist in the world fully. So what happens to that desire? He says that censorship is never completely eliminated, but merely reduced. The repressed material must submit to certain alterations which mitigate its offensive features. Repression is the relaxation of censorship, the formation of a compromise. So here's my first gambit of the evening. Cults operate under a kind of social repression. As something that disrupts our social equilibrium, makes us feel uncomfortable, maybe awakes in us desires or longings for things that we didn't know we could want. They are not a way to eradicate those desires in us. They're actually a way for those desires to flourish in the world. It's the formation of a compromise. That what cults all over the media do now is allow us to express what used to be absolutely unutterable as longings in our life. So while on TV, we might focus on the scandal, what actually grips us by cults is what they offer. They offer what has been fundamentally, I think, denuded from our life in the modern era. Things that have been rendered impossible to want or wish for. What are those things? What is it that cults offer? I'm going to tell you some things that are so basic that I think they'll speak to you. Cults offer unconditional acceptance, belonging, love, community, meaning, structure, acceptance. As we live in these catastrophic, terrifying times when so much feels uncertain, who wouldn't want surety, comfort, and succor? What if, instead of being inundated by decisions that seem to only ever render you more wanting, you're offered a sure and clear path to salvation and happiness and fulfillment? What wouldn't you do? That is, I want to ask the question, not why would someone join a cult? What if we ask the question, why wouldn't you join a group that promised you things you didn't know it was possible to want? And this is what gets played out in cult media now. So when I said at the beginning that cults offer a narrative, that narrative we have familiarized through repetition in cult media. Every cult documentary, if you were to watch it carefully, and I've watched thousands, follows almost precisely the same script. It begins at the end. It begins with the catastrophic downfall, the FBI siege, the followers wandering bleary-eyed into the sunrise to recognize that their beliefs have been misguided. And very quickly, it switches to what came before. And what came before was something magical. Often what comes before the fall and that satisfying catastrophe is utopia. A moment at which people feel as though they belong, that their needs are being met, what felt impossible in their normal lives can flourish, and they're not going to be called crazy or pathetic or wanting. In fact, they're going to be embraced. And while our traditional stories about cults passes over this moment quite quickly to tell us why we shouldn't want this impossible thing, the structure of cult media now over many episodes in these glossy, beautifully shot, carefully narrated forms, what that does instead is offers you one episode of the fall and 12 episodes of utopia. In those 12 episodes of utopia, those long, languorous hours that many of us spent, especially during COVID, alone in our houses, opens up a world that feels at once very far from the world we live in, and yet so close that maybe we can stop wishing it didn't exist. So if one of the things that cult media does is produce in us a desire for what we didn't know it was possible to want, it also has to do the work of repression. That is, we actually can't have all of those things. I'm sorry to say, in modern late capitalism, you can't have it all. You can't have unconditional acceptance, meaning, structure, and God with no cost. So in order to mitigate the desires that are awakened in these narratives, we have to find a way out. And what cult media has done, as our stories about cults often do, is focus on the charismatic leader. And we can talk in the Q&A, if you'd like, about the ways in which some of the focus on charismatic leaders in the last few months has made us believe that if you can simply do away with the power at the top, you can denude cults of their force. You can render them innocuous, you can end them. That the problem actually is with figures like Marshall Applewhite of Heaven's Gate, Jim Jones of the People's Temple, or Charlie Manson. It produces in us a sense of comfort that we as viewers, as people who are on the outside, can simply identify a threat and inure ourselves to it, while also having at least vicarious access to the pleasures that this group allows. This fixation on the leader and on the downfall that is almost always caused by the leader lets us also turn cults into objects of satire, of mere curiosity, of simply consumed pop culture. So recently, Netflix just produced a 6-part satirical documentary called How to Become a Cult Leader, in which it tries to, in fact, diagnose the conditions that allow someone to have inordinate power over a collective. It's tongue-in-cheek because it suggests somehow that we can understand charisma and we can inoculate ourselves against it. That if we stop being taken in by the outsized power of individuals, we can be smarter than their followers and yet still have access to the riches that their beliefs might offer. But that fixation on the leader misses the point of these groups entirely. That if you actually look at the structure of groups that we call cults, the thing that keeps people inside is very rarely a single person at the top. In fact, what keeps people inside are exactly those things that we identified at the beginning. That is, acceptance, belonging, care, structure, meaning. That comes from horizontality. That comes from being in, as Tim describes, a community of shared belief, where you share a vocabulary, where you don't have to translate yourself to people outside. No one on the inside thinks you're crazy. No one on the inside thinks you have a conspiracy theory. They believe that you exist in a condition of shared truth. That is an enormously heady feeling. To feel yourself and your beliefs vouchsafed by other people. That you can be in a world in which, while the outside might tell you you're dumb and wrong and too glued to your computer, in your community, you are among the chosen. You see the truth. You have access to the gospel. You understand how it's all going to end. This kind of immersion into the fantasy that you can know the truth and you can somehow game the structure of the cult narrative so that you skip the part at the beginning, that is, the part where it ends, and just stay in those 12 long episodes of utopia has taken over. So while we have hundreds of cult documentaries, in the last 10 years, that immersion into that narrative has changed us so fundamentally that the genre has changed too. Because we've gone from documentaries like this, these carefully narrativized forms of documentary, to this. This is on the Discovery Channel. The Garden, Cult or Commune is, I think, a bellwether of a new phenomenon. This is a reality TV show in which people are invited to join a community that has been openly accused of being a cult. And over 14 episodes, which is 14 weeks, we have contestants who travel to an off-grid community in Tennessee, where they try and join the community. They go through all of the community rituals. They make connections with people. And every week there is something like a tribal council. So this is far more Survivor than Wild Wild Country, in which one of these new acolytes is either allowed to stay or voted off the commune. And at that moment, where often people are voted off, they're asked the question, is this a cult or is it a commune? And it will surprise none of you good students of narrative that the answer depends entirely on whether they get to stay or whether they get to go. When you get to stay inside, it's a commune. It is a site of utopian possibility and a site of narrative victory. You have won the cult story. You've managed to tell it again in the right way, so it turns out not to be a catastrophe, but it turns out to be everything you thought you couldn't want. If you fail, if you're kicked off the island, it's a cult. And the end is all that matters. All that matters is the failure. You're supposed to forget all of the good stuff. You're supposed to forget all of the possibility. My question to you, though, is, can you forget? Being so immersed in this possibility, in having everything you didn't know you could want, are you able to go back to a place where you have more narrow desires? That is, what is it possible for you to want now, thanks to all these cults in your life? Thanks.
This is great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Poulomi. We now have plenty of time, a good 20 minutes to have a conversation, answer questions, and I hope that the two of you will also think together, because that's part of the point here, is to have the both of you think together. Let me start with one of the questions from the audience, and it's a question about the boundaries between cults and non-cults, between conspiracy theories and non-conspiracy theories. And while this isn't exactly where you ended, Poulomi, it was a question that kind of surfaced earlier on. One thing we could say is that at some level, every one of us is in some kind of cult, if cult is understood as a confined community, and every one of us probably is involved in some kind of belief system that verges on the conspiratorial. Our questioner even went so far as to suggest that maybe academia is one of the largest cults around. So what are the dangers of cultic thinking? What are the dangers of conspiratorial thinking? How can we become more self-aware, those of us who are outside, apparently standing outside of conventional cults, the kinds that appear in all the Netflix shows, those of us who are not members of the more vivid conspiratorial communities? How do we use the stories that you're telling to become more aware of the very pervasiveness of cultic or conspiratorial thinking? And how does it create, back to a term that you used, Tim, a kind of potential inclusivity by checking our own kind of cultish or conspiratorial mindsets? I leave it to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in really quickly. It's a great question. And it's actually a question that frames every semester of this cult class that I teach, because in the first few weeks, one of the things that students always want to ask is that a cult? And there's a lot of pointing at things to say, is that a cult? As though a diagnosis does something for us. That to say it's a cult lets us respond to it in some totalizing way. And what's clear is it doesn't. And often what we have to think about is disaggregating the disruption of what I call our social equilibrium with actual harm. It is true that many communities that are insular, that have charismatic leaders, that have rituals or structures that are more opaque to the public, get called cults. I'm not interested in whether or not people believe something that is strange, or if they live in heterodox ways. That is, for me, not the point of understanding cults. What is more interesting to me is how often we conflate unorthodox beliefs and insular communities with also the harm that often exists in them. That is, it's less interesting to me to simply malign people for believing and say, as Heaven's Gate did, that the Hale-Bopp comet carried on its tail a spaceship on which the Messiah rode. It's easy to laugh at that. And once you think about the ways in which we often look to the sky for meaning and succor, it's less funny. It does become important for us to think about how that belief and its insular structure enabled 36 people to take their lives. Harm is, I think, the part that we often conflate as being the same as unorthodox beliefs. It's really important for me for us to disaggregate those two things. to take seriously harm, but not have it be a symptom of unorthodox beliefs, but often something that's contingent, something that often relies on the structure of this group, but isn't the point of it. Otherwise, it's too easy to demonize and minimize people's beliefs and not take seriously the incredible power that these communities have in the world and have over their followers.
I love being on panels with Poulomi because she's so remarkably good at going right to the fundamental theoretical questions. I think what's interesting here is that, stories from the inside, if you flip it, become stories about the outside. So I'm very interested in both disruption, but as Poulomi points out, it's real harm, right? So when does a narrative lead to harm? I was interested, I started working early on sort of stories about witches and witchcraft in 19th century Denmark. This is long after the witchcraft burnings and the like. But what was really interesting was to see how do you know somebody's a witch? And the answer is not she turned me into a newt, but rather it's because I said so, right? This person is a witch because the stories ascribe that person to this position of significant threat to our economy, to our physical well-being, to our social well-being. And then what happens is that the strategy to deal with that is harmful, right? How do you respond to a threat? And there are different ways to respond to threat narratively, right? And so when people think about cults, there's also a narrative about how are we going to respond to what we perceive as the threat of this cult, right? And that can lead to actual harm, as well as within, these communities of belief. How are we going to deal with this disruption? What is our narrative next play? And narrative then can influence real world behavior. So that's really where I think this idea of harm is so crucial. How do we understand not only the creation of communities of belief, but the expression of those beliefs and the potential, benefits? That's what I really would love to see. How do we create these inclusive environments where it isn't seen as threat, or the strategy for dealing with threat is one that diminishes the threat in a way that isn't harmful. Unfortunately, what we see a lot are narratives of threat, and the strategy then is unfortunately one that leads to real world harm.
Okay, there are a lot of questions coming through. I'm gonna pick a couple, and although some of them are for one or the other of you, I think there are opportunities for you both to chime in. So one question from the audience started off asking about COVID, the coronavirus, and also has a kind of more general question about what happens when people ask sometimes controversial or difficult questions about the origins of, in this case, a virus, the origins of the pandemic. And the questioner asks, why has shaming curiosity become acceptable when it comes to, let's say, conspiracies? The question was asked before you spoke, Poulomi, so I will just add cults as part of it. Why is it okay or kind of normalized to think about these instances as shameful? And I have a follow-up question that I'll just plant now that you can also address, Poulomi, which is one of the questioners was really interested in what you had to say about want, and really the way in which questions of desire are what are revealed by a fascination with cults. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the fascination that cults reveal. Either of you can jump in. Tim, I started with
Okay.
you. So
Okay, you started with me. Okay, I was wondering.
curiosity,
I was
sorry,
wondering whether
shame and
you guys had
curiosity, and then kind of
yeah.
a little bit of the flip of that is kind of revealing what we want. Shame and desire are often conjoined.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I was asking these fundamental questions in the humanities. Um, so I think one of the things that's interesting is how curiosity then becomes a threat, right? So there is some putative world order and curiosity. Maybe this is actually a possibility. One of the ways you can challenge that is through narrative. Poulomi was also talking basically about a narrative war, right? There are two different stories or multiple stories going on here, and they're not reconcilable. And so if you are invested in a story that the virus let's just use COVID-19 because there are these different stories that are circulating, but it also signals which kind of group you're in, which community of belief you're in. So once you signal, oh, this was something that was engineered by the Chinese Communist Party, there are a series of other beliefs that you're also signaling are part of your narrative understanding of this event. If instead, you tell the story that it originated in a bat colony in northern China, it's a different group. Or if you signal that it was engineered as part of the 5G rollout, yet another group of overlapping, intersecting, and at times very contradictory narratives. So it's all about creating community and signaling which community you're part of, and then negotiating the boundaries of that, right? So somebody was asking about boundaries, and these boundaries are dynamic, they're contingent, and they're constantly being negotiated.
Did we lose Poulomi?
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. We'll get you spotlighted again. Okay. Do you want to chime in about either
Yeah, I'm
the
sorry to
shame
have
or the
missed-
desire?
Yeah, I'm sorry to have missed the latter part of Tim's comments, but you know, this gets to the heart of the question of cults, and I'm glad that Tim offered us the historicization of the COVID-19 epidemic, because actually, if you think about when the term cults really comes into popularity in America, and in fact, the way in which it is born on the wing of Cold War anxieties, we are in a repetition cycle that cults really become a threat, especially in America, in a moment at which there's an anxiety about communism. So when you have young, college-educated people who are the inheritors of what is supposed to be America's great prosperity post-World War II, turning away from capitalism and individuality towards communes, that threat has to be re-narrativized as an existential crisis, right? America is at stake. And so we have to actually turn communes into something that we can identify as a problem. And that is, I think, also about the kind of identification of desire, that you also have these young people then and now recognizing that a lot of the promises of a kind of progressive individuality in which you make more money and you conform often is kind of stultifying and emptying, and that there can be enormous satisfaction and pleasure derived from forms of life that take you away from that. So in my class every semester, one of the things that students do is they work all semester in what we call intentional communities, because we don't use the word cult after the first week. And at the end of the semester, they design their own intentional communities. And I have no problem sharing with you that they are terrifying in their brilliance. Because what my students do is they're able to, on the one hand, identify things that they fundamentally need and are lacking in their life, and then reverse engineer how to get them. And what you see played out in real time in this theoretical exercise is exactly this, where they can say, you know, I'm a smart, driven student who's always understood the path in front of me. And here I am now, and I don't know what's next, and it's terrifying. I need community. I am exhausted by decision making. I'm terrified of the uncertainty ahead. If I only had a given group of friends, a person who was compassionate yet powerful to guide me, who could actually give me advice in these very specific places, so many of my needs would be met. I would be happier and more at ease. And so in this theoretical exercise, they play out the limits of desire in a way that when they produce them through these presentations that are extraordinary, that they do social media accounts, they have films, they're unbelievable in their creativity. But what you see played out is something beautiful and tragic and terrifying, because it really identifies what is missing in their life and actually how easy it might be to fill some of those desires, but also the barriers that are there that seem insurmountable.
So Poulomi, you're saying that sets up a future conversation that we hope to have, and also a question that came from the audience, but that we won't have time, and we probably could have 3 days and still wouldn't have time to answer, which is, what do we do about generative artificial intelligence in this environment? Because in so many ways, it's precisely the AI that is or has the potential to be the friend, leader, responsive, caring, flattering thing, language model, mathematical object that so many are looking for. So it does seem, and Tim, you bring this up in your work using computational and cultural analytics, but now we're not about to enter, we are deeply within another moment for the rise of conspiratorial thinking, shifts in conspiratorial thinking, and also shifts in community and cultic relationships that no longer only involve other humans, but that are so deeply engaged with non-humans and with language models. I want to thank you both for being part of this conversation. I want to thank everyone who's in our audience, and I've been completely impressed to see the sheer number of you who stuck with us the entire time. I, have my little metric at the bottom, and it's rare to have just about everyone stay for an entire session. And I'm sure the reason that you did is because our faculty at Berkeley are so engaging, are involved at the very cutting edge of their fields, are doing things that really nobody else is doing, and are doing that not only in the library and their offices, but in the classroom. And what you got a taste of this evening was what it's like to be in one of our classrooms. We're hoping that this is the beginning of an ongoing series. This was the first, and we'll follow up after this evening's conversation to get your feedback and your thoughts on topics that you'd like to hear more about. AI is one that's very much on all of our minds. And we also will send you a link to our Fund for Faculty in the Arts and Humanities, because it really is our faculty in the Arts and Humanities that make absolutely everything possible here at Berkeley. Finally, I'd love to meet all of you, and if any of you are in town around homecoming, I'll be hosting a conversation about the Arts and Humanities at Berkeley. That's on October 4th. It's in Durant Hall I think it's at 10 in the morning, but we'll include the specific information in our follow-up. Above all, I hope you'll join me in thanking Tim and Poulomi, and I want to thank all of our staff who helped to get us all together this evening, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thanks very much.